This 1859 plantation portrait looks calm until you see what's hidden in the slave's hand. Humidity slicked the archive glass as Dr. Emily Carter eased a daguerreotype into the light. Outside, August steamed. Inside, 1859 refused to move. The Langley family sat arranged for order. William upright, Margaret composed, children steadied, a hound touching boots. 5 enslaved people stood behind, bodies aligned to someone else's plan. One woman interrupted the quiet. Chin lifted, shoulders square, gaze a fraction off the lens as if listening for permission no one could grant. Emily angled her loupe. Fibers, patina, scratches, a razor line where intent met silver. In the woman's right hand, close to her skirt, a folded slip creased twice, darker at the edge, harboring a secret kept for 166 years. Servants in portraits were meant to disappear. This one was making a signal. Emily bracketed exposures, logged the accession, and zoomed until the grain rose like pollen. Across the fold, something fainted into view. 3 marks. Initials? Dots too small to be decorative. The woman's grip was not timid. The knuckles formed a narrow ridge, tendons set. William's gaze pointed forward, hers pointed through him. A heat ripple crossed the window. The image answered with a tremor of meaning. Emily tested a filter, the paper brightened, and a hook surfaced, nested near a stroke that could be a T or a cross, or a road turning south. Hannah, the catalog noted later, house servant, age 35. The record wanted that to be the whole story. The photograph disagreed. Emily pressed closer and caught another detail, a second shadow along the fold, the outline of teeth marks as if the paper had been hidden in a mouth before the shutter dropped. If that is true, then the camera caught contraband in plain sight, and the message it trapped was never meant to stay silent. What happened next will shock you. Morning settled over Richmond with a humid haze that slicked the museum's windows and gave the conservation lab a quiet glow. Dr. Emily Carter powered the copy stand, leveled the column and settled a 19th-century daguerreotype into a padded cradle. She checked the plate's angle, logged the accession number and advanced a bellows macro lens until the silvered surface held steady under polarized lights. One pass of a fiberless cloth cleared the cover glass. She lowered her loupe. The Langley family resolved in lucid miniature, William in a rigid chair, Margaret poised beside him, 2 children anchored by parental gravity, a hound touching polished boots, and 5 enslaved figures placed to widen the family's aura of order. One woman stood a fraction forward, posture precise, gaze tilted past the lens as if measuring a boundary. In her right hand, close to her skirt, a folded paper pressed a thin shadow onto fabric. Emily raised the camera and shot a bracket of exposures for a high dynamic range merge, then repeated the sequence with raked light to tease information from tarnish. After each click she captured notes, lens height, light intensity, white balance, file name and a sketch of the plate's orientation. Metadata first, interpretation later. Routine steadied her even as curiosity climbed the spine. At the workstation she opened the first raw file on a calibrated monitor. Daguerreotypes reward restraint, over-eager corrections invent ghosts. She built a non-destructive stack, lifted midtones with a gentle curve, and sharpened edges with a conservative radius. The slip brightened by degrees. Along one fold, 3 faint strokes cohered near the edge, placed too neatly to be random scratches. She tried an edge-aware algorithm that emphasized boundaries without fabricating texture. The marks remained. Context mattered as much as pixel. A penciled slip in the case listed names and a date. The lining repeated it in ink. August 10, 1859. An imprint on the brass mat read Holt. Newspapers and trade directories confirmed Edward Holt, a traveling operator who promised family groups superior finish and who that summer advertised sittings at private residences around Richmond. The timing aligned with the plate. Background demanded a landscape. Emily pulled county deed books and reconstructed how William Langley assembled Oakwood Manor, a tobacco operation built through purchases, inheritances and loan. Agricultural schedules recorded acreage planted and hogsheads shipped. Insurance papers itemized outbuildings including a smokehouse rebuilt after a small fire. Ledgers tallied tools, seed and wages for an overseer whose signature stiffened season by season. A labor inventory for 1859 listed 50 enslaved workers divided among field crews, curing sheds, domestic service and skilled tasks. In that list appeared a house servant, age 35, entered without a surname and marked with a clipped initial that matched the catalog's later note. Hannah. Photography in that era rehearsed hierarchy. Owners claimed the center, chairs, tables and canes projected stability, a book on a knee suggested cultivation. Wives echoed that axis with gloves and lace, children promised continuity, a dog humanized authority, enslaved adults filled negative space as decorative proof of wealth, their presence serving scale rather than story. Hands folded, eyes lowered. The design taught viewers where to look and what to ignore. Within such choreography, deviations mattered. Hannah's hand did not fold, it presented a narrow creased slip to the camera, not brazenly, not theatrically, but with a measured confidence that refused to vanish. Emily rotated the plate beneath the polarizer. The paper's corner flashed and muted as the filter turned, behavior consistent with graphite or residue pressed into fibers. She logged possibilities, pencil dust, soot, wax transfer without deciding. She ran focus stacking across a ladder of microfocus positions to extend the depth of field. The composite returned a cleaner edge and a soft shadow on the dress fabric, as if pressure had transferred something onto the cloth. She documented settings, saved versions and mirrored the stack for a second look with fresh eyes. To check herself she built a sample of regional group portraits with enslaved subjects and mapped hand positions. Many included handkerchiefs held symmetrically, a stylist trick to occupy fingers and prevent motion blur. None displayed a narrow folded slip angled outward like a subtle band. Hannah's slip aligned to the lens so that light would find it, yet stayed understated enough to survive inspection by anyone who assumed props belonged only to owners. She traced compositional lines on a transparent overlay, diagonals from corner to corner, a vertical through William's face, a horizon along Margaret's shoulders. The paper sat at a counterpoint that tugged vision toward Hannah and away from the official center. That tug felt intentional. It asked why a servant would be holding anything during a controlled performance. It suggested she had allowed herself. Context extended to the maker. Emily plotted Holt's notices on a map and saw a pattern. Summer weeks near Tidewater, then inland runs as the heat peaked. The schedule put him in Richmond during early August. Within days of the photograph's printed date, she searched for unrest at Oakwood and found a clipped line about a domestic disturbance remedied. The sort of euphemism that hid more than it revealed. In William's account book, an entry purchased an iron hasp and an extra padlock shortly after the sitting. On the same page the count of crib keys increased by 1. She returned to the screen. The marks along the folds survived every gentle method. One resembled a small crossbar, another bent like a road turning south. The third anchored them. Emily did not declare letters. She did not need them yet. Consistency across methods persuaded her that the paper carried information rather than noise. Hannah's expression at high magnification resisted easy summary. The mouth held a measured line. The chin met the camera, but the eyes aimed slightly to the right, toward a space beyond William's shoulder, as if attention had been claimed by something out of frame. That choice altered the image's temperature. Authority looked outward with confidence. Hannah looked past authority with purpose. She printed a proof and taped it to a folder. Notes became a memo for Dr. Thomas Hayes, her colleague who studied resistance strategy. She included contact sheets, method summaries and a cautious hypothesis. The folded slip might be a signal intended to be seen by someone who knew how to read it. Before sending she tightened provenance. She photographed the case exterior, velvet pad, matte pattern and hinge repair. Then compared them to internal exemplars. Materials and wear matched the period of manufacture. Research widened to people beyond the core family. Emily skimmed correspondence for purchases, debts and discipline. A doctor's invoice billed treatment for fever placed between entries for lamp oil and nails. Receipts recorded cloth for dresses, needles and a spoon, charged to household use. The plantation journal moved a young child to the main house for care. The tone stayed transactional. Patterns, however, described a person. She pulled more images to test bias. In one neighboring estate's portrait, a woman touched an apron with both hands, symmetrical and neutral. In another, a man gripped the back of a chair, eyes averted. Those gestures kept them quiet. Hannah's hand refused to be quiet. Its angle communicated placement, not accident. Emily cross-checked Holt again and found a digitized receipt book fragment at a partner institution. 2 entries near the week of interest listed family groups, plantation, and a note about using faster chemistry for humidity. That detail matched the sheen on the Langley plate and reassured her that exposure conditions aligned with practice. Before shutting down, she ran a conservative multispectral pass with narrow band illumination that sometimes teases contrast from low-density marks. The folded slip brightened along one edge and ghosted a faint echo onto the dress fabric, as if graphite or soot had transferred under pressure. She still could not read words. She could read intent. Her pulse quickened, not from heat but from recognition that the image refused to behave like an ornament. It behaved like a statement carried into a room staged to deny statement. She saved files, backed them up to the lab server, and drafted an email to Hayes, seizing a plan to consult Dorothy Ellis, an elderly archivist, known for finding decisive scraps in unprocessed packets. She added a note to message a photographic materials specialist for an outside review of her enhancement protocol. Caution protected both subject and claim. The plate would remain in the lab until every step sat on firm ground. As she powered down the polarized lights, the surface returned to a placid mirror. The lab looked orderly in that reflection, almost still. Yet Emily understood stillness here as a disguise. Oakwood Manor had presented serenity to Holt's lens, but the composition contained a challenge. A folded slip held by a woman named Hannah had bent the frame's hierarchy, set among chairs, gloves, and polished wood. Its narrow shadow insisted on being seen. The investigation had begun with light and angles, now it pressed into motive, risk, and mess. Emily locked the case, exhaled, and felt the day tilt toward difficult, necessary questions about truth. The software opened on a neutral workspace while the conservation lab held its hush, and Emily loaded the raw stack she had built the previous day. She began with gentle denoise to calm glitter without smearing detail, then applied contrast-limited equalization to lift midtones cautiously. The folded slip by Hannah's skirt answered immediately, a fine edge separating paper from dress like shoreline meeting tide. A guided filter protected boundaries while smoothing speckle. Along the crease, a pale track appeared, not random abrasion but a purposeful line pressed into fibers by pressure. Emily split the view and toggled a masked layer that confined adjustments to a tight polygon around the hand. Control samples taken from William's lapel and Margaret's glove stayed flat, reassuring her that changes targeted the right region. She documented every step with times, versions, and parameters. Next, she opened reflectance transformation imaging captured under raking light. A virtual lamp rolled across the plate, teasing micro-shadows from hidden grooves. The fold revealed an indentation running slightly diagonal, with 3 tiny disruptions spaced like landmarks. Overlay alignment matched pixel for pixel with the earlier composite, ruling out artifacts made by software. Emily assigned pseudo-color to separate tarnish from graphite. The distinction persisted through multiple kernels. She cued a conservative blind deconvolution to correct the subtle blur caused by humidity during Holt's session. Then she stacked narrow bands from the multispectral set. A principal component with low variance isolated a short horizontal stroke, a curved line bending downward, and a centered dot that pinned the junction. Rulers confirmed alignment with the plate's geometry. Nothing drifted. She exported frames and printed a neutral proof for analog review. Only then did she call Dr. Thomas Hayes. He answered on the second ring, voice bright, despite static. Emily summarized the workflow in clipped steps while pacing between the stand and the monitor. Thomas requested a share, leaned close, and asked her to nudge the cursor right. He laughed softly. "That is placed," he said. "Not incidental, not fidget. Placed." Emily exhaled and returned to caution. She overlaid a control drawn from regional group portraits shot by traveling operators. Handkerchiefs, aprons, and tools ground hands. Thomas studied Hannah's face at high magnification. The jaw set like a quiet brace. The mouth drew a balanced line. The eyes aimed a fractional degree beyond the lens, as if attention had been claimed by a point no one else could see. She calculated exposure, distance, vigil, he murmured. She reframed the stage they built. Emily nodded, then pulled the Oakwood ledger scans. Columns appeared in William Langley's clipped script: field crews, curing shed hands, laundry, domestic assignments. There appeared Hannah, age 35 with duties listed plainly and no surname. The cold shorthand tightened Emily's throat. Thomas sat back, eyes bright. Deliberate placement, he said. What would the marks encode? Emily rotated the pseudo-color layer and checked consistency. The horizontal line held. The bend leaned south. The dot anchored them. 3 small elements, yet their rhythm suggested direction rather than ornament. She ran a local contrast near the lower lip of the fold and saw a shallow divot, not dramatic enough for theatrical effect. More like the sign of a slip pressed briefly between teeth before the gathering assembled. We need chronology, Thomas said. They plotted Holt's newspaper notices on a map and overlaid them with the date embossed on the brass mat. August 10, 1859. Listings placed the operator in Richmond that week. Beyond the lab, context gathered like thunder. Militias drilled more often. Editors sharpened talk of plots. Patrols chased gatherings after dark. Churches argued. In such weather, a family staging authority before a lens believed it displayed harmony. An enslaved woman with a folded document believed something else, that paper could travel through the very image meant to bury meaning. Emily steadied herself and asked Thomas to attack assumptions. He requested negative controls and edge case. She built a mock-up, a strip of rag paper folded twice, marked faintly with graphite, placed near cotton on a mannequin, lit to match Holt's probable setup. She photographed the mock-up, then repeated the pass with variations to test whether brightening might invent false stroke. Her shoulders lifted, their reading held. They returned to the records and found a terse memo about replacing a lock after a misplaced key, and a payment to a patrol for a night search. Those lines, bland at first glance, now implied pressure before Holt unfolded his equipment on the veranda. Supervision tightened when someone signaled, Thomas said, tracing dates with his finger. And someone signaled inside the portrait. Emily studied Hannah again. Intelligence shone without romance, visible in the coordination of muscles around the mouth and eyes. The body maintained poise while the hand bent hierarchy. The family sat like a thesis. Hannah wrote a footnote that subverted the thesis. Thomas remained on the call, silent while she breathed through heat that pressed against the glass. Finally he spoke. We owe her rigor, he said. Rigor, and an audience. She agreed. They drafted a plan. Consult the elderly archivist Dorothy Ellis for unprocessed packets related to Holt. Request an external review of enhancement settings from a photographic materials specialist. Prepare a measured narrative for public display that avoided fantasy while honoring agents. Before shutting down, Emily zoomed once more into the slip. A faint echo of graphite seemed to have transferred onto the fabric where pressure met the dress, confirming earlier hints from the spectral component. She could not read letters. She could read the knowledge brought an ache she recognized from difficult histories, the feeling that a person living under surveillance had calculated risk, chosen a moment and trusted a future stranger to see. She turned from the monitor and stared at the proof pinned beside it, where the family froze and the maplet slept in plain sight. Hannah's gaze, angled a fraction away from the organizing center, refused erasure. It did not plead, it declared. Emily allowed herself one human response before returning to protocol. Then she wrote to Thomas a short paragraph meant for visitors who would stand before the case. It read like an invitation instead of a lecture. Consider the bravery required to send meaning across time while watchers stand near, while a lens opens, while rules choke speech. Think about ancestors whose names failed to appear on ledgers, whose choices flickered in margin. If you carry a story of quiet defiance, share it. Lives change when hidden courage receives witness. Thomas replied with a single sentence. That will help people listen. With tasks assigned and safeguards in place, Emily closed the session, logged times, and dimmed the light. The plate's surface slid back to the mirror. Her reflection hovered over William's certainty, Margaret's poise, the children's drilled patience, the dog's relaxed paw, and the 5 enslaved figures arranged for display. Hannah stood a thumb's breadth forward, holding a narrow slip that had just become for Emily and Thomas the first visible chapter of a longer account. Tension from 1859 still traveled across the room with summer heat, yet hope traveled with it, carried by a folded document that had survived inside an image designed to render its carrier insignificant. Consider how many rooms still carry silences like this. How many families hold traces of courage between recipes, leases and receipts. If your grandparents, neighbors or community keep memories whispered at kitchen tables, bring them forward, write them down, and share them so that intent, like Hannah's mess, crosses distances no patrol can stop, and no carefully staged portrait can mute. Let it be seen now. The Richmond Historical Museum's research room felt smaller than Emily remembered. A narrow chamber of brown light and dutiful fans where humidity blurred the windows and made papers smell faintly of tea. A clock ticked above a bulletin board crowded with rules about gloves and pencils. She signed the register, surrendered her pen for a golf pencil and followed the archivist to a table under a green-shaded lamp. The circle of light fenced off the world, leaving only wood, cotton ties and the quiet abrasion of pages turned with care. She loosened the linen straps on a gray box labeled Langley Papers, 1850-1862, placed glass weights at the corners of a folder, and forced her breath to slow so moisture would not dot the margin. Inside waited household accounts sewn along the fold. Ink returned William Langley's hand in compact strokes. Coffee by the pound, candles by the dozen, shoe repairs, bonnet trimming, a piano tuner's fee, a carriage repaint before fair season, totals squared neatly at the right margin. She turned a page, tobacco tallies, curing shed repairs, a new bell to call field hands at dawn and release them at dusk. The script kept a tidy pride, the numbers arranged a life meant to look untroubled. The next packet altered tone. Ledgers of labor inventory listed 50 enslaved people assigned to field crews, sheds, laundry, kitchen, sewing, infants' care and household service. No surnames, only first names or initials, ages, valuations and penalties recorded with the same balance as lamp oil. A column counted rations by weight, another measured cloth yardage. Near the center of a page, written without flourish, a house servant appeared. Hannah, age 35. The hand that softened for piano tuning cooled for human labor, the ink's firmness becoming a kind of mask. Emily copied the entry exactly, then traced a fingertip just above the line without touching paper, as if heat alone might honor the space a name should have filled. While the archivist fetched a second cart, she studied the room's tight geometry, low ceiling, steel cabinets shoulder to shoulder, a dehumidifier murmuring in the corner. August clung to everything despite the machinery. She rubbed her forearms dry against her sleeves, and lifted a folder sealed with an old red wafer cracked like enamel. William wrote to a business partner in measured cadence, about weather, shipments, and the price of leaf. The voice sharpened only when delays threatened cash. Margaret's hand appeared on heavy paper with an embossed crest, inviting a cousin to tea, praising a new dressmaker. Domestic smoothness held until Emily opened a letter dated mid-September. The script remained neat, yet the pressure changed. Strokes cut deeper, indentations bit through fibers. William complained of unrest among the house servants, and ordered greater supervision during afternoon hours. He noted the purchase of an iron hasp, the fitting of a lock on a cabinet previously left open, and the replacement of a trusted coachman with a man described as less familiar and therefore more reliable. He recorded payments to patrols for night watch and wrote, in a line underlined twice, "No message shall pass under my roof without my knowledge." Emily angled the page so the lamp grazed the surface, the doubled underline sliced visibly across the grain. She wrote a calm citation while her pulse climbed. She set the letter beside a proof of the daguerreotype she had carried in a sleeve. August 10th. A family arranged authority on a veranda while a traveling operator worked in humid air. In that stage a woman stood a fraction forward, holding a folded slip near her skirt. Weeks later the master wrote about unrest, locks and vigilance. The sequence felt less like a coincidence and more like a reaction. She asked the archivist for legal papers from early October. He returned with a slim folder wrapped in acid-free tissue. The document within carried a watermark and a red wafer scarred along a fold. The heading announced a bill of sale dated October 6, 1859. Seller, William Langley. Buyer, an agent acting for a New Orleans firm. 3 persons transferred, described by given names only, ages, heights by approximation, and conditions that reduced bodies to traits. One line read female about 35, literate, scar on left forearm valued slightly higher than the other. The remaining 2 entries were younger, one with needle skill, one sound teeth. No surnames, no kinship recorded. Payment terms were spelled in a hand that turned warm when money moved. Emily felt the chair's wooden edge through her clothes. She copied the language exactly, then requested city papers and shipping registers to match the itinerary. While the archivist looked, she returned to the September letter. What had read as control now registered as fear. Greater supervision followed a breach, or the suspicion of. The photograph had not been decorated. It had become a line of powder visible only when struck by light. In her mind she mapped distances, veranda to desk, desk to patrol, patrol to port. She pictured Hannah walking familiar halls, knowing which hinges groaned, which boards flexed, and weighing every movement beneath an owner's new regime of keys. A side file contained memoranda of household incident. One described a misplaced key, and the installation of an iron hasp on a drawer. Another recorded that a servant had been found lingering near the front steps after dusk, and had been sent to quarters with a warning. The pen cut harder on those lines, civility thinned to the edge. Emily transcribed the phrases without flourish and added dates to a running grid. The archivist returned with a small envelope labeled in pencil, Holt. Inside lay a neighbor's note, half brag and half jest, that his wife refused a sitting because the August damp has made our hair unfit, followed by praise for the Langley's veranda as a fine stage. Stage. The careless word. A photographer had arranged bodies on that stage. A woman in the line had calculated distance, angle and attention. Emily secured the envelope and asked for harbor notices around the sale date. She recorded contrast with the same care as evidence. Wealth spoke in ledgers that granted dignity to objects, pianos, gloves, lamps, while human lives appeared as units to be timed, valued and moved. Margaret's invitations glowed with embossed crests. Hannah's name stood plain above a price. The gulf widened as Emily copied phrases that worked like blows. Girl to sewing, boy to dairy, woman to big house, sold south. None of those terms admitted sorrow, yet sorrow pooled in the space the ink refused to see. She wrote notes in neutral verbs. Wrote, purchased, locked, posted, sold, shipped, not because neutrality comforted, but because it kept the record from slipping into drama. The harbor column listed departures to New Orleans within the week. The schedule fit too neatly to ignore. If the group had left in those days, they would have traveled from rooms they understood to a port where agents converted bodies into line items and deckhands counted shadows down a gangway. Listing Hannah as literate may have raised the price while increasing danger. Literacy turned possession of paper into a punishable act. The paradox pressed against Emily's chest. A folded slip caught by a camera had set in motion a regime of locks, and then a sail that tried to erase the hands that held that slip at all. Afternoon softened the room's edges. Another researcher whispered about a property dispute. A student traced names onto index cards. The fan turned without hurry. Emily drank from the hall fountain, returned to the table and checked her grid for gaps. She read the bill of sale like a map with missing compass points. Down the left margin marched formulas pretending neutrality. Across the center moved first names without surnames, ages without birthdays, scars without stories. On the right trailed money, and at the bottom sprawled signatures that converted people into public fact. Closing time approached on soft soles and a courteous voice. Emily logged box numbers, call slips, and pages to hold overnight. She flagged the October document for high-resolution capture, and left instructions for non-invasive enhancement of the September letter so pressure and depth could be measured without strain. Before she stepped away, she copied the last sentence of William's note again, not as a flourish, but as weight. No message shall pass under my roof without my knowledge. A message had already crossed that roof inside a portrait the author believed he controlled. Outside, air lay thick as cloth, as if Richmond remembered every August and stacked them one atop another until brick held heat like a kiln. Traffic murmured along the avenue. A child tugged a hand. A vendor folded an umbrella. Emily stood on the steps with the proof of the Daguerreotype tucked in her bag and pictured a narrow slip pressed between fingers that did not tremble. The day had given her ledgers that loved objects, and records that belittled people, a letter that named unrest, and a sail that moved lives south. She did not need certainty to hear the motive. The photograph had spoken in the language of light. The papers had answered in the language of control. Between those languages, a woman's act remained intelligible and stubborn, refusing to be filed away. Catherine Langley Wright opened her door before Emily could knock twice. A clock striking 3 in a hall lined with silhouettes and a staircase polished by generations of shoes. The house wore late Victorian confidence. Pressed tin ceiling, mahogany sideboard crowded with blue willow plates, lace curtains taming Richmond's humid light. A runner softened the floor, lemon oil lingered on walnut. Catherine, tall, silver-haired, linen shirt neatly tucked, Offered iced tea with the reflex of someone practiced at difficult talks. "You are not here to flatter the Langleys," she said, leading Emily past a parlor bristling with portraits into a study where a fan turned with steady patience. "Good. I am not here to hide them." She set 2 glasses on magnolia coasters and lifted a leather box from a shelf. "Family papers inherited through my grandmother, plus items we found behind a false panel during a renovation." She opened the lid. Inside lay ribboned letters, browned visiting cards, a mourning brooch holding a curl, and a journal bound in green cloth stamped ML in flaking gold. "Margaret Langley," Catherine said. "Read July through October. I marked what may matter." Emily pulled on gloves and opened to a ribboned page. The entry for August 10th described a visit from an itinerant photographer, Holt, who proposed a likeness on the veranda before the heat grew brutal. Margaret arranged cushions, warned the children not to fidget, chose gloves with a better finish, and praised the hound for holding near William's boots. Then came an aside about housewomen placed in view, one called Hannah holding a slip to neaten her posture. The phrase polished intent into etiquette. Emily kept reading. Lemonade sweating on silver, Holt's brisk method, a tone that pretended order. She flipped forward. August 13th. William uneasy. 17th. Night watch instructed to be more attentive. 19th. Cabinet fastened with new lock key kept upon William's ring. 21st. Coachman replaced. Control thickened line by line while the voice remained composed. "What did you hear growing up?" Emily asked. "Whispers," Catherine said, eyes on a river painting. "An incident in '59. A servant named Hannah who grew opinionated. My great-grandmother scolded guests for gossip, then argued with her husband about dangers we court by too much gentleness." The story stopped there. "When I was young I found nails in odd places as if pictures hid patches where something had been pried up. That panel covered a shallow cupboard. Inside sat the brooch and an invoice for a locksmith. I do not pretend innocence. I refuse ignorance." Emily opened in September. The handwriting never lost grace yet cut deeper. The nib pressed hard. "William distrusts the temper of servants," Margaret wrote. "He commands stricter watching of afternoons. I am pained yet persuaded it is prudent." A later line noted almost grudgingly that one woman looks with a fixed expression ill-suited to her station. "He speaks of messages." Another sentence added. "He will not have them." Catherine fetched a tin of photographs. Cousins posed for carte de visite. None showed Hannah. "People my family owned rarely earned the camera," she said. "When they did, names disappeared." Emily placed a proof of the daguerreotype beside the journal. Margaret's gloss faced a face that refused disguise. "The folded slip carries marks," she said. "Faint, deliberate. We think she angled it for the lens." Catherine studied the proof. "I keep staring at her mouth," she murmured. "It says I will survive your rules while making my own." She turned to October 6th. "You asked about sale. Records are sparse, perhaps because shame arrived later than deeds. Here is a note of money received from an agent who purchased 3 people bound for Louisiana." In pencil my grandmother added, "Hannah likely among them." "The museum holds the bill of sale," Emily said. "Then my family's euphemism breaks," Catherine replied. They moved into the front parlor, where portraits watched with painted calm. An ancestor's gaze followed a gilt frame. A girl in white held a book she might never have read. "Wealth taught this house to call discomfort refinement," Catherine said. "Language turns cruelty into duty and obedience into grace. Under that polish, decisions remain." She looked again at the proof. She made. Back in the study, Catherine opened a drawer and produced a cousin's letter from late summer. It mentioned unpleasant vigilance and fear about the grounds at dusk, then congratulated Margaret on admirable composure during that portrait. The compliment now sounded like a verdict. Emily copied the lines and returned to the August 10th entry. "Neaten her posture," she repeated, heat rising despite the fan. "No," she signaled. Catherine poured more tea. For years the family treated incident like furniture polish. Applied to keep surfaces shining. "I prefer truth." She shut the green book and rested her palm on the cover. "Scan it. Publish where the record resists forgetting. I consent. Do not make my ancestors grand. Make them legible." Emily promised care and sought permission to quote. Catherine nodded and walked her through rooms crowded with objects. A pianoforte yellowed to cream, a sewing stand filled with bone bobbins, a sampler signed only with an initial. Evidence of attention lavished on things appeared everywhere, while people who maintained those things went unnamed. In a guest room, a framed receipt for a dress hung above an empty hook. Absence moved through the house like a draft. At the threshold, Catherine paused. "I have wondered whether Margaret knew exactly what Hannah did," she said. "Her journal punishes truth into manners. Look at her verbs, commands, supervises, replaces. Fear made the men act. Habit taught the women to translate action into calm phrases." Hannah answered both with a hand. Cicadas pulsed from the elms when Emily stepped onto the porch. She promised to send images that might sharpen dates and drove back to the lab with the journal on the seat and the proof tucked behind her clipboard. Threads drew toward a knot. William's paranoia, recorded in elegant ink, had not appeared from the air. It followed a choice made in daylight. The sail that hauled lives south wore a receipt's grammar. The reason lived in a narrow crease that caught light and refused to bend. That evening Emily and Thomas scanned the journal, preserving indentations, then read aloud the sequence from August to October. The rhythm never shouted. It ticked. Watch, lock, replace, sell. Beneath it moved another rhythm created by a hand that lifted a folded slip into sight. Emily drafted a note for future viewers and sent it to Catherine. Small acts of defiance can reroute history's current. A quiet gesture made under pressure, even while watched, can carry meaning farther than anger imagined. Look into your own family room's attics, trunks, recipe boxes, letters and photographs. Listen for stories that never reached ledgers. Share what you find so courage that hid out of necessity can breathe where light finally reaches. Catherine replied with one word that felt like permission. Yes. And if you uncover a fragment, a name squeezed into a margin, a symbol tucked beside a date, bring it forward, speak aloud, let communities hear, because remembrance restores agency where records tried to erase it. Do it carefully and together. Emily reached Dr. Laura Bennett by video as cicadas pulsed at the museum windows and late heat pressed against the glass. Laura, at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, listened while Emily laid out the chain. The August portrait with a folded slip angled for the lens. The September letter ordering a tighter watch. The October bill of sale sending 3 women south. When Emily finished, Laura leaned forward. "Paper in a servant's hand during a staged family sitting isn't an accident," she said. "Those faint marks along the fold could be a compact map, bar for a crossing, curve for a bend, dot for a depot, drawn in forms not letters because forms travel safely through surveillance." If Hannah meant the camera to catch it, she expected a reader somewhere ahead. "Where do I start?" Emily asked. "New Orleans," Laura replied. "Sales into Louisiana fed sugar parishes and city markets. Begin with notary volumes, succession files and commission merchants' ledgers. Buyers protected credit with descriptions, skills, scars and even literacy when it raised the price or danger. Hunt for a woman near 35 with a scar on the left forearm. If she vanished by spring, look for a complaint about harboring or a reward notice that confesses more than it intends. Keep timing in mind. After mid-October, Harper's Ferry panic hardened surveillance. People who moved had to be ingenious. 2 days later, humidity rolled through Louis Armstrong Airport like a kiln's breath. Emily rode a streetcar beneath live oaks, snagged with beads, and entered the Amistad Research Center, where the air smelled of cloth, gum arabic, and the faint sweetness old paper exhales. A conservator guided her to a table under tall windows striped by blinds. Outside, the river shouldered past in brown bands. Inside, gray boxes rose like bricks. She signed forms, surrendered her pen for a pencil, and opened notarial volumes from October 1859. Page after page converted lives into entry. On the 6th, a sale from a Virginia planter appeared. 3 women transferred to an agent for a city firm. Ages aligned with Richmond's bill. The middle line fixed her attention. Female, about 35, literate, scar on left forearm, priced higher than the others. A clerk added, house service, needle skill, as if usefulness softened what the word sale refused to admit. She requested adjoining ledger. A commission merchant recorded arrival near the month's end, doctor's inspection, and temporary lodging. A companion file listed charges for food, laundry and a replacement bodice for woman 3, proof that punishment could be dressed into order. Another page advanced funds to a manager in Plaquemines Parish, and noted worry about a servant who shows too much opinion regarding movement. The language pretended neutrality while fear breathed under every stroke. Emily copied lines, dates and amounts with steady hands and a tightening throat. A packet wrapped in brittle blue yielded the next turn, a sworn complaint, dated May 1860. The agent alleged that a woman speaks quickly, reads well enough to trouble discipline, bears a scar upon the left arm, left by night with help from a boatman who supplied cane crews. Patrols searched levees, questioned dockhands and posted notices in French and English. None named her, all feared her. Repetition across archives, age, literacy, scar, pulled the outline of a single life into focus until Hannah stood again, not only in silver but in ink written to deny her. Laura rang at noon, voice bright with threads. "I mapped patrol routes for that spring," she said. A sympathetic ferryman near English Turn moved people upriver when fog and tide agreed. From there some hid in attics near Rampart, then boarded coastal schooners hugging marshes west before turning north. Others rode flatboats under timber sliding into cypress shadows when lanterns swept the water. Routes bend with weather, sound and kindness. If she disappears from records in April, floodwater helped. She paused. Compare your marks again. If the bar sits near a crossing, the curve near a bend, the dot near a depot, the slip in her hand isn't an ornament. It's a rote. Emily built a grid and traced names across columns. A doctor billed saline for a forearm wound in November. A seamstress charged for hooks, eyes and thread to reinforce waistband, paid in coin rather than script. A carpenter delivered a footstool with hollow for hymnals, an innocent phrase that might shelter more than a book. She sketched a river with notches for landing, penciling initials beside the bends. T by a carpenter who repaired pews for a church known to host late cleaning. M near a woman who mended pilot coats and kept a spare pallet for weather. A single dot beside a warehouse where a night watchman reputedly slept deep after dawn. The shapes echoed the Daguerreotype strokes, bar, curve, dot direction without alphabet, meaning inside constraint. The archive added a jolt. A planter's letter from late winter scolded a manager. The literate woman stirs foolish hope on settling yield. The reply recommended sail farther west, unless discipline corrects her habits. Margins already knew the ending. By April the agent reported disappearance. Fishers saw a skiff moving low under canvas at daybreak, cutting across a skin of mist. Patrols found footprints near reeds and a heel mark at a cutbank, then lost the trail at the waterline. The paper called her an asset and a loss. Emily read The Woman and the Choice. Afternoon stretched across the reading room in pale band. Between requests, she stood at a window and watched barges slide toward the Gulf, engines dulled by glass until motion resembled thought. Distance here was counted by bends rather than miles. Survival grew from choosing when to wait, when to move, and whom to trust for a night. Even inside ledgers built to freeze people into inventory, she saw decisions forming, which hymn to hum as warning, which stair to test, which door to leave on its latch. The more the files tried to reduce, the more the person expanded. Laura's digest landed by email, dense with names gathered from minutes, anti-slavery newsletters, and private letters that never reached the press. A carpenter carved compartments into footstool. A seamstress stitched codes into waistbands, so a touch could locate a coin, a pin or a folded direction. Dock workers altered tallies so one body did not appear on a list. A Quaker shopkeeper kept a ledger with deliberate blanks, each gap a record of aid that refused to endanger the living. Networks did not only flow north, sometimes they curved sideways along coasts and swamps until wind, tide or a captain's silence opened a gate. The map inside Hannah's hand would have spoken that flexible grammar. Move here, wait, turn when fog thickens, listen for the hymn, knock twice, follow the bend. By dusk Emily held a timeline linking Richmond's veranda to a river city loud with trade and surveillance. August a composed portrait hit a slip angled for sight. September locks multiplied and hours tightened. October sails south, signature smooth while lives frayed. Winter complaints about a woman who read without permission and measured rooms with her eye. April disappearance logged as loss and tracked in frantic notes that revealed more than they concealed. After silence in planters' files and a whisper in church minutes about a visitor with a scar, who carried news like bread, the arc felt less like a rumor than a row. Urgency sharpened hope. Every recurrence of scar and literacy pushed the person at the center of this work into clearer view. Every sterile term, opinion, discipline, property slid away like silt off oars. What remained was will. Emily laid the Daguerreotype proof beside New Orleans papers, and saw how a folded slip steadied in a room designed to suppress meaning, became a key carried through heat, glare and paperwork, through narrowed doors and careful departures. One woman used paper to draw routes around people who believed they had closed every path. After closing, she opened her hotel window to let the night breathe. Music drifted from a courtyard, brass softened by humidity. On the desk, the proof caught lamplight. Hannah's grip, measured and calm, refused to be theory. Emily wrote one sentence for anyone who would stand before that image and feel recognition bloom. Small acts carried under watch can travel farther than violence imagined. If your family keeps a rumor of a crossing, a name penciled inside a recipe, a scar described without context, share it. Let fragments meet, let rotes reappear, and let hidden courage like a bar, a curve, a dot lead someone else through the bend. The Friends Historical Library received Emily like a held breath of wood, paper and light. Gray morning pooled across tall panes. Dust drifted like slow rain, and the hush of readers moved between oak tables where minute books waited under muslin. She signed the register, took a pencil, and followed a librarian into a compact room that smelled of linen fiber and gum. Here, the quiet felt deliberate. A kettle clicked behind a staff door. The tray brought to her table held meeting minutes, a relief ledger and a small envelope of private notes. She loosened cotton ties, set glass weights on the corners and read lines written in a hand that practiced restraint even when urgency pressed beneath it. One entry, 5th month 1860, recorded aid to a woman lately from Louisiana, sober in judgment, with a scar upon the left arm, who assists in settling those bound for the river road. A later minute, 8th month, thanked friends who contrive compartments and keep rooms that listen, because craft preserves those whom words would betray. No names appeared, yet two initials surfaced like buoys the writer could not bear to sink. T.W. and M.R. Emily paused. In Richmond, a free black carpenter named Thomas Wyatt built hollow risers into footstools and repaired pews in a church whose back door opened to a lane. A Quaker seamstress named Margaret Reeve kept a second-floor room above a shop that smelled of soap and thread and stayed lit after dusk. She copied the initials, dates and phrases into a grid, then turned to the envelope. Inside lay brief notes, their corners rounded by hands. One described a woman newly come, strong in memory, who traces the bend and the bar with her fingernail on wood when ink should sleep. Another spoke of a visitor from the Gulf whose reading makes fear smaller, who counsels to move when fog and bells agree. The voice never named her, yet it drew a person clearer than most ledgers dared. Calm, literate, marked by a scar precise under watch. Emily looked up and watched the light shift across the table's grain. The daguerreotype's folded slip returned to mind like a tide, and with it the faint strokes she and Thomas had seen. A short bar, a gentle curve, a single dot and two initials that hovered near the edge. If pressed rather than written, the marks would survive a search. If shown to a lens, they could ride forward inside the very likeness meant to advertise control. She booked a small room and called Dr. Laura Bennett. Emily read the minute that mentioned a woman from Louisiana, and the notes that thanked T.W. and M.R. Laura listened until silence felt like another instrument, then said, "The crafts fit the initials and the initials fit your city." If she pressed, not drew the letters, imaging should find depth. Bring the plate back. Let light pull relief from the fold. Emily thanked her, returned the boxes, and asked the librarian for directory entries on Wyatt and Reeve. The index produced addresses that matched her Richmond map. She snapped permitted photographs, copied lines where cameras were forbidden, and left with a promise to send scans for the catalog when her citations were complete. Night passed against the train windows. Signals became red beads strung along steel. By dawn, the lab had taken on its clean brightness. Thomas rolled the multi-spectral rig into place, secured the daguerreotype on the stage, and lowered the polarizer. They began with narrow bands from violet to near infrared, each pass revealing a slightly different truth. Software registered stacks, corrected drift, and separated components into false colors that peeled tarnish from adhesive residue and from anything that behaved like graphite. The first composites brought back what Emily half expected, and still felt as shock along the slip's fold. The bar hardened, the curve gained spine, the dot sharpened, and two tiny letters, scored rather than drawn, lifted from the paper's fibers. T.W. and M. Thomas exhaled a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a prayer. He pulled a surface topography pass that mapped microscopic height. The letters deepened under this light. A nail had pressed them, not a pencil. Pressure had made script. She wrote with a tool no patrol would seize. She turned absence of ink into a cipher. Emily overlaid a transparent sheet and traced the bar, curve, dot, and initials with a fine pen. She scaled a street map of Richmond and aligned the overlay to the neighborhood they had already studied. The bar met a bridge west of Oakwood's orbit, a crossing Wyatt would have known from jobs and errands. The curve echoed a back lane that slipped behind the church, where he fitted footstools with cavities sized for a coil, a coin or a folded scrap. The dot settled squarely at the stair that rose to Reeves' workroom, the listening room that minutes had thanked. She built a legend for her own focus: bar for crossing, curve for turning, dot for doors, initials for trusted hands. Then she ran control. Another plate without marks produced only a random texture. The polarizer reversed. The letters held. The stage rotated a few degrees. The relief held. She logged every parameter, saved every iteration, and branched files where interpretation began, so another reviewer could walk the road she had taken and test its stone. They opened the Philadelphia scans and read again the minute about the woman from Louisiana, who traced routes without naming places. The journal's restraint matched the plate's grammar, meaning by form, not by word. Standing inside that concordance, Emily let herself imagine the veranda on August 10th. Heat presses at the edges, Holt counts, William watches, Margaret steadies a glove, children learn stillness, a hound flattens an ear, Hannah lifts the slip into the angle the camera will learn. A nail has already left the bar, the curve, the dot, and the letters near the fold. The map is now small enough to pass, large enough to guide, silent enough to survive, bright enough to be read by strangers decades later. Image becomes a bridge, hands make For completeness, she and Thomas pulled receipts, church notes and city directories. Wyatt's billing recorded pew repairs completed in late summer. Reeves' account listed hooks, eyes and binding for a bodice, a phrase that had also surfaced in New Orleans when a replacement garment was purchased for a literate woman after sale. Threads tied north to south and back again, not as a line but as a cord knotted by many hands. Emily drafted text for the gallery while the rig cooled. Then she read it aloud, voice steady and fierce. Imagine hiding a rote in a portrait choreographed to make obedience look like grace. Imagine scraping letters into paper with a nail, because ink could betray you, then holding that slip steady as the lens drank light and owners measured your breath. Imagine trusting a carpenter to carve shelter into furniture, trusting a seamstress to keep a room that listens, trusting a meeting to maintain silence where silence guards lives, trusting unknown eyes in the future to see what you could not say. If your family holds a rumor of a crossing, an initial inked inside a hymn book, a recipe card with a name that reappears beside a door, a photograph whose background figure looks just past the lens, share it. Let unsung work step into the air. Courage travels farther when witnesses multiply. She closed the plate's case, as daylight angled across the lab windows and traffic shook the avenue. Outside, birds worried at a crepe myrtle. Inside, letters that were never supposed to surface had risen from a fold that masters had failed to see. TW and M had become more than strokes. They had become people whose craft bent space. The bar was no longer a mark, it was a crossing. The curve was no longer an ornament, it was a turn that cut surveillance. The dot was no longer a speck, it was a door that waited for a knock. A portrait built to celebrate ownership had learned to carry a map. Hannah's hand had taught it how. Now the network it concealed, carpenter, seamstress, meeting, messenger, river stood legible, not as legend but as proof that ingenuity outruns watchfulness when resolve presses meaning into the smallest possible space and dares the future to read it. Emily found the Confederate report in a narrow folder whose twine had been retied so often that the fibers looked like frayed rope. Inside lay letters from 1861 stacked in neat bundles, brittle and confident. One report, signed by William Langley in a careful hand that failed to hide strain, addressed a district officer about subversive commerce in persons and messages. He wrote that a woman formerly in my household called Hannah is seen upon the river roads and at mill yards, advising runaways, carrying tokens and conveying intelligence to abolitionist sympathizers. And he demanded vigorous checks upon her unwholesome influence. Emily transcribed the language, photographed the watermark, and noted the groove where his pen had stuttered. The man who had once priced lives now begged the state to contain a mind that would not return to the ledger. She filed the scan beside the daguerreotype overlays, and the Philadelphia minutes that thanked helpers identified only by initials. The threads pulled toward a truth she had already felt when the letters rose from the fold. Hannah had returned to Virginia as passage rather than property, carrying knowledge like a lantern shielded by her own body. At the National Archives, a clerk rolled out a Provost Marshal register from 1865 whose spine creaked like a hinge. Emily turned pages of cramped script until a line lifted the room. Assistance rendered by one Hannah, colored during recent movements, known to conduct families from Chesterfield toward farms along the river. Scar upon left arm, reads well accepted provisions and a path. The tone was clipped and practical, naming labor rather than panic. Another entry noted that 4 souls reached friendly ground through the efforts of the same woman, and recommended that her route be respected by patrols in federal employ. Emily copied the citations and stepped outside with steady hands. 2 voices now stood side by side. One stamped authority and demanded walls, the other recorded gratitude and traced open doors. Genealogy began with scraps. A family Bible recorded births on a brown page. Emily traced a daughter listed as a domestic worker in 1870, a son apprenticed to a carpenter in a Richmond shop, owned by a man whose initial matched Wyatt, and a marriage record from 1881 bearing a witness named Reed. Oral notes from the 1930s mentioned an old conductor with a scar who taught songs with directions in the beat. Each hint bent toward the same sense. She wrote to a descendant named Lila Green, and drove to a tidy brick house where marigolds lined the steps, and a kitchen window threw warm light onto the sidewalk. Family filled the room: cousins, a great-aunt, a teen and an uncle. Lila set a photograph of her great-grandparents on the table and opened a cedar box that smelled faintly of pencil shavings. Inside lay a folded blank scrap, softened by years of handling, and a small iron nail wrapped in cloth. "My grandmother said keep these dry, keep them near, and never trust a bottle of ink," Lila explained. She said a woman with a scar on her left arm taught our line how to move when watchers looked busy. She told the story while shelling peas and braiding hair. Emily placed a proof of the daguerreotype beside the scrap. The family leaned in. The teen drew a line that bent to a dot, then wrote the initials. The great-aunt closed her eyes. "I have felt a hand at my back in tight seasons," she whispered. Emily shared the Confederate complaint and the Union note. Silence followed, not empty but full of breath, as if memory had finally met paper in public. They spoke about the exhibit now taking shape. Emily promised that the label would name Hannah as a conductor and that descendant voices would stand beside the case. The teenager asked whether a map could be made without letter. Emily traced shapes on a notebook: a bar for crossing, a curve for a turn, a dot for a door, and initials pressed by a nail. He practiced the grammar with a fingertip on wood. That night, Emily drafted the 4th invitation for visitors, a message meant to travel home tucked into pockets and phones. Honor those who carried courage through narrow rooms. If your family keeps a rumor of nighttime walking, a hymn that changed when strangers passed. Initials scraped beneath a chair, or a folded blank page saved because a grandmother said it mattered, bring those fragments into light with care. Teach children how small acts under watch widen paths. Share stories across porches and tables so that courage gathers witnesses. Before the opening, she returned to Catherine Langley Wright and set the new documents on the parlor table where the green journal had lain. Catherine read in silence, then looked at the photograph again. "I wanted truth more than comfort," she said. "This is the truth. It shames what my people did and honors what yours survived. May I stand with the family when the case opens?" Emily said yes. Catherine untied a ribbon from a small box, and placed it in Emily's hand. "It fastened a cuff," she said. "Fasten a label with it." The gallery preview filled the museum's theater. The projection showed the surface relief pass that lifted letters from a fold. Then the overlay that aligned bar to bridge, curve to lane, and dot to stair. A child asked whether fear ever wins. Emily answered carefully, "Fear rules hours, courage outlasts years." People filed toward the case, where glass guarded silver. William sat rigid, Margaret composed, children still, a hound at polished boots, and 5 enslaved figures arranged for display. Hannah stood a fraction forward, hand angled, message steady. Hannah's descendants gathered near the label that named her role and cited both the Confederate complaint, that called her a danger, and the Union record that recognized her service. Lila held the blank scrap like a tiny band. The teenager rested a palm on the case, and mouthed the initials. Catherine stood nearby with quiet attention, neither excusing nor centering herself. Emily watched faces register shock, pride, grief and relief. The room breathed. After the crowd thinned, the families met in a circle by the exit. The great-aunt promised the kitchen version for younger cousins. A woman hid a map in a portrait, returned when danger grew, and helped people move until the war ended. Lila lifted the scrap and nail. "You came back," she whispered toward the plate. "You kept going, we will too." Emily felt the line between past and present slacken and knot, an old cord retied by many hands. Then she turned to the visitors who lingered near the doorway and offered the final invitation written for this moment. Honor Hannah's legacy by telling a story of resistance in your own community. Ask elders about songs with directions, corners where lanterns once signaled, names that vanished from ledgers, but lived at tables. Write what you learn and share it, so that memory becomes shelter. Bring fragments together until rotes stand where watchfulness tried to narrow life and widen it with witness. Carry that work forward, and let the courage pressed into a small folded slip illuminate the distance still to travel. Evening light pooled across the Virginia Historical Society's gallery, as visitors drifted past glass cases, and paused before the Daguerreotype that started a reckoning. The walls carried a hush of fabric and footsteps. Brass rails caught amber reflections. Labels glowed like small lanterns guiding attention from object to truth. Emily stood a few steps back, letting the room find its own focus. On the mount, silver and shadow assembled the familiar scene. William rigid, Margaret composed, 2 children still, a hound touching boots, and 5 enslaved figures positioned to display someone else's order, while one woman stood a fraction forward with a folded slip angled toward the lens. Beside the plate, a crisp label condensed months of work into language a crowd could carry home. It read, Daguerreotype, August 10, 1859, attributed to Edward Holt. In the right hand of the woman identified through records as Hannah, age 35, a folded paper bears pressure marks revealed by multispectral imaging and surface topography. These marks form a simple map, bar for crossing, curve for turn, dot for door, with initials TW and MR traced by pressure rather than ink. Linked evidence connects those initials to Thomas Wyatt, a free black carpenter who built hollow risers into footstools and repaired pews in a Richmond church, and to Margaret Reeve, a Quaker seamstress who maintained a listening room above her shop. The image staged to assert mastery carried resistance in plain sight. Below the paragraph, another panel offered dates, September 1859 letters by William Langley, describing unrest and tightened supervision, an October bill of sale sending Hannah and 2 others to a Louisiana buyer, spring, complaints in New Orleans about a literate woman with a scar who disappeared by river, an 1861 Confederate report naming Hannah as a dangerous conductor along mill yards and river roads, an 1865 Union record acknowledging assistance, guiding families toward safety. People read, leaned close, stepped back, and read again. Catherine Langley Wright stood near descendants of Hannah, her hands folded, her gaze steady, ready to listen rather than defend. Lila Green held a cedar box with a blank scrap, and a small iron nail wrapped in cloth, tokens kept through generations with instructions to protect them from ink and damp. A teenager traced a small bar, a bend and a dot on the case rail with a fingertip, then whispered the initial. Camera phones rose, yet the room never felt like a spectacle. It felt like a vigil that welcomed conversation. Emily moved between clusters, explaining how bands of light, polarized and careful registration pulled relief from fibers without inventing fantasy, how control plates and blind tests kept enthusiasm from turning into error, how overlays aligned the slip's grammar to bridges, lanes and doors marked in the record. She kept method subordinate to meaning by returning people to the central act. A woman under watch pressed a route into paper with a nail and held it steady while a family posed. A curator thanked the families and invited brief remarks. Lila lifted the scrap and said, "We kept this because a grandmother told us courage travels better on quiet paper." Catherine followed, "Truth matters more than comfort." The teenager added, "Maps can move without letters. Music and memory carry them." The audience breathed at once, a sign that a room of strangers had turned into witnesses. The label's final lines offered context without apology. Hannah's gesture challenged the antebellum power structure that counted keys, priced bodies and staged order. By compressing a route into a fold, she redirected the camera's gaze and rerouted lives. Read the image not only for composition, but for agency. Visitors began to trade family fragments. A teacher described a hymnal annotated with small dots that changed near doorway. An elder recalled a story of a lantern placed low on a sill when river fog thickened. A carpenter mentioned a footstool with a compartment found beneath a church stair. A seamstress remembered a great aunt who always kept an extra pallet for weather. Each detail felt like a late key finding the right lock. Emily collected emails for follow-up and asked permission to record oral histories so that whispers would not fade. Then she returned to the case, reading the label aloud one more time, not to rehearse achievement, but to honor craft. She watched visitors circle back, draw friends near, point and touch their own sleeves, as if to feel the weight of a folded page. Hope moved through the crowd without noise. Now the work extended beyond the room. If you can reach Richmond, come stand in front of this image and take the time a message deserves. Let your eyes adjust until the bar, the curve and the dot rise from silver, and consider the cool scrape of a nail cutting initials designed to survive a search. Tell someone what you see. Share a photograph, a thread or a short reflection on X, so others learn how a portrait became a passage. Ask elders about rumors of nighttime walking. Bring what you find to local archives, libraries and historical societies, where staff can help verify and preserve. Adopt a document, sponsor a scan, volunteer to transcribe an old ledger so names that lost surnames regain community. Invite classrooms to decode evidence using empathy and rigor, and make sure descendant voices guide interpretation. The gallery will change as new fragments surface. Your attention can change it faster. Hannah's act confronted a system built to choreograph appearances, to render people into inventory, and to declare obedience as beauty. Her decision exposed a seam in that choreography and widened it into an X. That is why this case belongs first to her family, why Catherine asked to stand with them, and why a ribbon from a cuff, a nail from a drawer and a paper without ink can feel heavier than bronze. Join the work, walk through museums with slower eyes, write down stories that only live at table, support community groups guarding Black archives, ask curators to credit craft that hid life in ordinary rooms. When you post, name the people whose labor turned danger into movement. When you teach, protect complexity. When you listen, hold silence long enough for memory to step forward. Most of all, carry this example into your own searching. Look again at portraits, town ledgers, church registers and attic boxes. Imagine what agency might be hiding at the edges. Trace small marks, follow initials and invite others to help. Let witness multiply until routes reappear on maps that once pretended they did not exist. If you cannot travel, share this story today so the network grows through screens as well as streets. Stand with descendants who kept fragments safe through long seasons. Honor the bravery that pressed meaning into a fold while watchers believed nothing was happening. The gallery lights will dim at closing, but the work does not end here. Carry it into kitchens, classrooms, buses, barber chairs, and porch. Carry it into councils where budgets decide whose memory matters. Carry it into quiet lists where a single added name can mend a line broken by sale. Visit the exhibit, bring a friend, and tag the story on X, so the signal travels farther. Do it now. Then turn toward your own block, your own town, your own archives, and ask what waits behind a cupboard, under a stair, inside a song. What happened next will shock you. Discover the stories waiting in your own backyard.